Hey, construction enthusiasts. Before we dive into today's episode, a quick shout out to the OGCA Construction Symposium, the go-to event for industry leaders. This year, it's bigger and better, with an expanded education program, an interactive trade show, and exclusive networking opportunities. Join us at the Blue Mountain Resort and Conference Center from April 11th to 13th. Visit ogca.ca for details. Don't miss out on the OGCA Construction Symposium, where innovation meets industry excellence. Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey, and with me today I have
Victoria Lanteigne. Hi, Warren. Thanks so much for having me. I am the principal of research at Stephen Winter Associates in New York City.
And what you specialize in is embedded equity. So just to start out, could you explain what that means?
Sure. I think equity in the built environment is something that's an emerging approach. And really, it's about ensuring that our building spaces and communities are designed in a way to support really marginalized groups that have been traditionally overlooked in design, and ensuring that everyone is having equitable experiences when in our buildings.
Not that I doubt you, but how is design specifically failing marginalized communities? I would assume part of it is that you build expensive places that can afford to be sustainable first, and then that goes to rich people essentially, or rich corporations, and not so much people in marginalized communities. But you tell me.
Yeah, I do think that is part of it. I also think, my work is kind of uniquely focused on design and the way that equity is physically manifested in the environment. And so a way I think that design is kind of failing marginalized communities is really by frequently not soliciting input of groups that are traditionally overlooked in the design process. And, I don't think it's a secret that the architecture industry is dominated by predominantly white, able-bodied men. Mm-hmm. And so when we're not soliciting input from those voices that are traditionally not at the table, these lenses are really reflecting an adopted belief of what's necessary rather than putting strategies forward that are rooted in lived experiences. And so I think it's really about changing the design process in order to impact the design outcome.
Now, what are some examples of people actually taking what you're talking about and implementing it? For example, in some public buildings now in Canada, for Indigenous ceremonies, they've set up rooms that have specifically different ventilation, so you can do smudging ceremonies and stuff involving smoke that you couldn't otherwise do to address that disparity you couldn't do before. So, what are examples of that, say, in America?
Yeah, I love that example. And thankfully, we are seeing some projects that are taking the next step. Some I've been really lucky enough to research in my own work. A great example is the Wing Luke Museum in Seattle, Washington. This is a project that was built hand in hand with the Asian American community, and we see a lot of really unique design aspects within that project that really reflect a safe and culturally appropriate space. Another great example is the memorial at Harvey Milk Plaza in San Francisco, which is really designed to be an inclusive space for the LGBTQ+ community. And arguably, this is very important considering the infringement upon LGBTQ+ rights that we're seeing in the U.S. and really kind of around the world. And even most recently, I was traveling through Newark Airport, and there's a beautiful new terminal designed by Gensler that has not just one or two, but multiple series of all gender restrooms that are equally as enjoyable and prominent to use. And so I think a strategy like that really just supports anyone of any gender identity to be able to have that facility and feature.
Now, just as an aside, when you mention a beautiful New York airport, that must mean upgraded LaGuardia, because nobody else, including LaGuardia back in the old days, was in any way beautiful.
I know people don't believe it. You got to go. You got to go to see it.
I haven't seen it since the old LaGuardia, but and they're all not that great. But I guess LaGuardia is now because they spent $1 billion. Anyway, complete aside. So how much of this is because of economics? Like people just don't want to spend the money to do it.
I think it is a misconception that including equity-focused design is always going to cost more. Yes, you could maybe spend a lot of money and have a high budget on these really fancy technological pieces or, these elaborate, artworks. But It doesn't always necessarily have to cost more. And in one example, going back to the Wing Luke Museum, something that the community really wanted was to preserve a piece of a historic building that really told the story of early Asian immigrants in that space. And arguably, preserving that may have been a cost savings rather than kind of redesigning it. So I think it doesn't always necessarily have to cost more. But yes, engaging with the community can be costly and it can be time consuming. And I'm not quite sure if that is the biggest hurdle. It could be a hurdle, but I think the real challenge is that people want to make sure that they're engaging community if they do it effectively and meaningfully. And that is really why I have dedicated my research to building resources and tools to support design teams to work hand in hand with community members, as well as offering some design guidelines that they can use to kind of get those ideas going.
Okay, and one other factor is and you've mentioned this, there's a industry fatigue around DEI and social justice movements. I'm not saying that's a good thing because it isn't, but it is a thing you got to deal with. So how does one deal with it or work around it?
Yeah, I do think we are seeing a little bit of fatigue on all fronts, which is, a normal, I think, response to these types of social justice movements. Certainly one that we don't want to see, but in 2020, we saw a lot of architecture firms making pledges to support, DEI efforts both internally and externally. And speaking from a point of view as someone who's been trying to get this really adopted and implemented in projects, I actually don't know that it's fatigue. I think there's interest. I do think it's going back to we're not quite sure how to do it. And there are, of course, resources that are hitting the market. They're not quite at the same level or scale that we see sustainability or even really healthy building yet. But I do think that there's a lot of interest, but there's not the roadmap on how to get there yet. So I think that is one of the biggest issues.
How do marginalized communities suffer in non-equitable environments? I mean, it seems like an obvious question, but we need to hear an answer to it.
I think that generally it's a persisting feeling that I'm in a space that was not designed with me in mind. I'll speak on behalf of myself. I do identify as a member of the LGBTQIA plus community. There have certainly been instances when I have been in a space with my wife where we are very aware that, we were not thought of in the design of this space, whether that is, artwork reflecting, heteronormative couples or, just kind of more conservative leaning messaging. So certainly there's that level of, we were not thought of, but then there's also this aspect of the usability and functionality of a space. I'm working right now on a project to design a pool that supports children with disabilities to learn to swim and enjoy that space better. Even though the ADA was passed in 1990, today communities and particularly the disability community is still experiencing feelings of mismatch when let's take the example of a public pool. And so there's a long way to go. And again, this just underscores the importance of connecting with communities and end users because we are gaining such interesting input on how to truly create more inclusive spaces than any of our laws or regulations could outline.
Now, when it comes down to building stuff, people want actual solid numbers to go by. How can you measure the ROI, and how are we measuring now that maybe isn't telling the whole story?
Yeah, I think measuring the equity impact is something that we are just beginning to explore. There are tools that exist. I don't think anything has really been widely scaled or adopted at this point. And, in my opinion, and I work with a building performance firm, right? So what we do is we measure how buildings perform, whether that's, for the planet or for people. And what we've traditionally seen is numbers. We see outcomes. We see, energy usage, water usage, and these are all really important. But when it comes to equity, I think that we're really looking at human experiences. And this is where, it gets really interesting. We can bring in concepts from environmental psychology. We can bring in, aspects of social justice and just feelings of belonging. And to do that, I do believe we have to kind of bring a qualitative lens to this. So yes, we can gather some numbers, but we also have to be tapping into those experiences. And really, I'm glad that you asked that question, because it is the next stage of where I see the next stage of my research going, and I'm really excited to dig in there.
And if people want to know more about, or maybe they're building and they want to know how they can implement it into their projects, where should they go to find out more about these issues?
Yeah, well, they can certainly visit our website, Stephen Winter Associates, at swinter.com. We've got a resource there. It's called the Building Equity Standard. And certainly, take a look. There's a framework of goals that can be used both to support community engagement, as well as in instances when, unfortunately, community engagement may not be possible. It's at least goals to get the design team kind of thinking, okay, how do we really think about, brainstorm how to embed equity into the design? And then there are some starter design guidelines that can be taken and adopted and tailored for specific end users. So we're really excited about it and think it's a great place to start. And I think my contact information is on there as well. And anyone is free, of course, to reach out to me.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Warren.
And that's it for this episode of the Construction Record Podcast. You can hear us on Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music, as well as on the Journal of Commerce and Daily Commercial News websites and the constructionrecord.libsyn.com. Thanks for listening.